As an indicator of where my brain activity is right now, I just spent the last couple of seconds blinking and watching the camera record the second half of the blink because it was interesting. And with that, we're gonna get started with this April wrap-up because it is May 2nd, and I should have done this yesterday. I just looked up what March's book count was. So far this year, we've had 20 books in January, 10 books in February, 15 in March, and now for April, it's 10. So I don't know where we're going to end up, but it's an interesting fluctuation. For the month of April, it was super busy, and I think that's part of why I feel very foggy right now. Besides allergies, it's just like the gravitational pull as the tide that went out with all my energy and expectations now rolls back in. So we're dealing with that, and that's just why I've been slow last week and today, continuing the pattern, but hopefully we'll get back to normal pretty quickly. I don't know, we'll see. So, which books did I read in April? The ones that I started in March but finished in April include Prisoners of Poverty by Helen Campbell. I read that as an ebook online. It's for research for the book that I'm writing, and I skimmed the ending, several chapters because I think I'd gotten what I needed to out of it. So I don't know if you call that DNF or just hunting and choosing what you want. The next book, number 2, that I finished in April was The Cruise of the Nona, and this I had started as a nonfiction pick for March of the Moderns, but I didn't finish it in time. So I finished this at the very top of the month, and it was interesting. It was a sailing memoir, but basically an excuse to rattle on about philosophical questions by Hillaire Belloc. And I was intrigued because he has a very French name, but is very British in his thoughts. So there were some interesting things that he talked about. He was a bridge, so this is in the 20s. He was thinking a lot about late Victorian politicians and thinkers, and it was very interesting to hear his thoughts about some of those things, and not agree with them entirely, but he seems like an interesting fellow. So that was that. And the third book that I finished in April as a leftover was The Fair Women, which was a big old book that I got from my library. There's my little books in April. This was another book for research. The fair that they're talking about is the 1893 World's Fair, and this went into highly detailed accounts of all the intrigue and politics and correspondence and dust-ups, basically, that happened in the planning of all the different aspects of the World's Fair, and it was highly complex. So that was super interesting, and I, once again, zeroed in on some of the things, took notes, took pictures on the details that I thought would be interesting for my story. Okay, so that's the first 3 that we carried over from March. And then in April, what did I have? I started The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy, which I was buddy reading with Tori and Jennifer at Hufflepuff Discovery and Jennifer Brooks, respectively. And we haven't had a discussion about this. They didn't organize something to do together, and I feel like they're doing a read-along in the next month or 2, and so they're talking about other things, but I am not in the inner loop. So my thoughts about the Woodlanders. So the last Hardy I read was in high school, and it was Silas Marner. Was it in high school? It must have been high school. I think it was 10th grade. And it's mixed up in my head with, like, fairy tales of Rumpelstiltskin, because there's not many tales that I read as a youngin' about weaving. And so I'm not sure I have a very clear view of what that was about, but I do remember specifically the Wheel of Fate, and I'm sure it's because I read through my notes so many times to get that right on the tests. The Wheel of Fate, you know, if you go around, you're going to end up where you started. So don't try to change the way nature has made you. And saying that now, do I appreciate that? Do I see that in the Woodlanders? So I made lots of notes on the Woodlanders going through it. It was an ebook from the library as well, and so I couldn't write or note tabs in it. But I did take some quotes. That's what this side is. This is all the Woodlanders here. Most of them were snarky quotes because I have to admit I was doing a little bit of sniggering at the language that Thomas Hardy uses. There are several words I came across that I was like, okay, what does that mean? No, like, this could have been 200 years earlier with some of the words he was using that were so abstruse. So that already, like, ticked a box. And then we start off and are focusing on a certain character, and she ends up to be treated as an incidental character throughout the narrative. And she's the poorest character we come in contact with, the one with the least agency and the least amount of hope. And so she doesn't grow, she doesn't change her station, she's always acted upon. I didn't appreciate that either. So, there's that. The landscape descriptions were beautiful. The forestry images, the comfort that the writer obviously had with the seasonality and the way of life and the intimate knowledge of things that no longer can be taken for granted. I enjoyed that. The central conflict, the characters that were just repositioning the triangle over and over, and is it this way, is it that way, will she, won't she, like, I didn't really love that either. I heard comments from other people being upset with how wishy-washy the main female character is, and it seemed justified. She just got new information, she struggled with this, she got, it seemed to be justified how she kept changing her opinion, but that being the central conflict was kind of weak for me. The way that the secondary characters that created the tension were disposed of, again, women who seemed incidental, and I didn't appreciate that. So there's a lot going on that I think maybe someone can give me a non-Silas Marner, non-Woodlanders recommendation for Thomas Hardy, and I'll put it on my list for next year because I don't need another one of these this year, but that can be my final, like, give it a go, maybe something different, and after that I can just say, no, I'm not a Hardy fan. Okay, so that was book 4, and that's my discussion of the Woodlanders. Then I had a reread, which was pretty fun. I had an idea of doing a video based on this, and I went through and I put tags in, and then discarded the idea as too ambitious, which is kind of how my April went. So this is Lost in Translation. It's a really just nice book about language. There's a nice illustration. There's an example of a word that doesn't really have an equivalent in English, and you get to see language that it's in and get a little insight. So Ella Frances Saunders. I just reread that for a little bit of comfort. That's book 5. 6 was Earth Calling. This is my Buzzwordathon book. So I had several to choose from, but I went with Earth to satisfy the Earth, Moon, Stars, Universe prompt. And this is one I've had for years. And it's a climate change handbook for the 21st century. It wasn't too much that I didn't know, but it was an interesting choice of what to bring together for the most important issues and how to frame it. It started off with a foreword by Caroline Meese, and I think she's interesting and at times has been inspirational, but I'm a little bit more wary of her after the presidential bid. I don't know, I thought that was a bit strange. And in this, her voice is very out there and not too compelling. So this is why I started it and then put it down and didn't read it for a long time. So we have an understanding of the system. Then there's a chapter called The Bed We Have Made. Then there's the whole section about waking up and looking at what we're addicted to, such as oil, the trouble with seeds. Then the next section is reconnecting and sort of action and how to address a lot of issues, but not in a comprehensive way. I don't know. 3.25? Anyway, that was interesting, but there's another book that got at that similar type of issue in a much more compelling way to me, so we'll cover that in a second. Lighting, there we go. So I had this, I only recently picked up from Backstory Books, and it is the Penguin Classic Book of Victorian Women in Crime. And I had read it and appreciated it, but there were several stories in here that were written by men that were published before women were detectives. They all had sort of a similar bent, and it's not that the book is dated, but that the stories that were 100 years old were like, wow, really different for women in crime in 1860s, even in the imagination of the author. So there are some interesting stories in here, but not anyone I want to run out and read. Although, having read this book so recently, I got the chance to speak with the editor of this volume and hop onto a live show interviewing him about his newest edited collection, which is about Maurice Leblanc's collection of stories about Arsène Lupin, which was really cool, and I talked about this on my last live, but it's a Netflix series, so the book is like super, super popular now, and so that was really neat to be able to talk with Sarah DeVello on Mighty Mysteries and Michael Sims last Tuesday. So that was fun. So here's another one that I started, put down, and picked back up. Cod by Mark Kurlansky. Roz at Skylight Dandling about the books also just finished this. I have another book by Kurlansky called Food of a Younger Land, and I know he has several books out about single, I don't want to say ingredients because that's definitely being dismissive, but singular cogs in the food system world, and how the history of the human interaction with those elements of the food system has changed it and us and the world, and so it's pretty interesting. I haven't read Salt, which is probably what made him the most famous, but Cod was really good, and Food of a Younger Land is part of, I think it's part of the stories that the WPA collected during the Depression, so I should read that soon. But Cod was really interesting. It takes you into politics, it takes you into the age of exploration, it takes you in a little bit into salt, it takes you into the mid-century cod wars of Iceland, which I had never heard of, so that was really cool. And, a little bit more about fishing rights than I never thought about, because even being a Californian, I don't fish, and I didn't grow up eating a lot of fish, and so it sort of didn't cross my mind. But having watched Seaspiracy recently, even though it's not too groundbreaking, and having read this, I think, oh, well, yeah, there's some work to do there. And I also follow a few people who are in the fishing trades, like lobster fishermen and local fishermen off Atlantic Canada on TikTok. And so that's been another sort of education about the native fishing experience and problems that are happening right now. So really, really interesting, even if fish are really not. Then I picked up The Lamplighter, which I've had for a while. Anthony O'Neill is the author, and I've got a couple tabs in here. Interesting. So this was not what I expected. I thought it was going to be a sort of mystery steampunk thriller, and it sort of walks the line of like supernatural horror philosophy. Like, I kind of want to give this to Pay. I think he might dig it. But it left to me feeling like cheated a little bit. But it's still really good writing. And there were several passages in here. I think that's what the tabs are. Several passages in here where I was just in awe of like how well a certain chapter was done, or a certain like walk they went on. And I was like, I should write this down because I really liked how he executed this. And that doesn't happen very often that I'm aware, but also in favor of how the writing is done. Usually if I like it, I don't notice it. So this is an interesting read from a writer's point of view. Set in Edinburgh. I think that's why I originally picked it up. I don't have this one on here. I need to add this. All right. So Louise Erdrich, Love Medicine. This was the pick for the Taste Life Tea Weiss book club on Patreon, and we read Survival Math in February and this for April. And the request for June is something not so heavy. It was a very good example of a book that teaches you how to read it as you go, because at the beginning I didn't understand what was going on, like at all. And then as I got through and started to connect, I got confused because I was trying to figure out who was who, and there wasn't a family tree in here, so I ended up, for the discussion, I actually looked it up online. But by maybe the 2/3 or 3/4 mark, I was somewhere between letting it go and understanding the relationships, the, you know, who's granduncle and niece and whatnot. And there's a lot of terrible things that happen, and it's kind of like a domino, the way it just sort of radiates out and sort of keeps radiating like a wave in a lake, because the family is close and the community is close, and everybody knows everybody's business, sort of. I'm not turned off of Erdrich books for sure, but I think I would go back to, I think Midnight Librarian has a recommended order to read in, and this is not the first, but it's the first one I had in my possession, so that's why I went ahead and read it first. But I think I may go back and look at what Melita recommends, and then try that one first to see if that helps, like, I don't know, make me want to go on in the world. It doesn't feel like it's part of a series. The books about this community are definitely in the same universe, but not dependent on one another in any way. I would feel like. Maybe I'll change my tune when I've read another one, but that's what my sense was. So very, very thought-provoking. And awareness raising. Second to last, we have the book that made me think the most, Dark Age America by John Michael Greer. I had this shelved in the wrong section. I thought I was picking up something about race learning, and note, this is climate change, cultural collapse, and the hard future ahead. And basically, when I studied in grad school and thought about the different strategies to address climate change that are either mitigation or adaptation, this is saying, don't waste your time on mitigation, fools. You got to adapt, and you got to do it like 10 years ago. So his argument was very compelling. It wasn't as sort of wishy-washy as the Earth Calling book. And he bases his analysis on history and the decline of civilizations. And one of the most salient points was the complexity of society and how when that starts to break down because the people at the bottom can no longer support all the people who depend on their labor. And I thought, oh, ooh. Yeah, that's hitting home. So apparently I'm 10 years late to learn how to farm, but that's not going to stop me from going down to California this summer and trying to learn how to garden, because no time like the present. I yeah. You know, I think of myself as conscious about environmentally sound choices, but there's still an amount of plastic I throw out because of what I consume. And yeah, it's hard to find a medium ground between like going off grid and trying to be a survival nut or whatever, and living in a community with people and trusting a group to do the right thing. So he's advocating the second thing. But yeah, just really, really interesting. I think he lives on the East Coast, but he grew up in Washington, had some interaction making the rules of the Druid community here. He had a blog for a decade called the Arch Druid Report. And so that's even more intriguing because I've definitely looked at Druids and things like that, pagan seasonal rites and sort of interacting with nature in a different way. Those books as well. So having that in his background was not a deterrent. But yeah, just like super writings on the walls, dudes. It's like very little that I could say, oh no, I disagree with that. So that's scary. I don't think that's what's got me slowed down, but maybe it's part of it. My last book for April is Where the Lost Wander, which is by Amy Harmon, and which was a paperback book that I picked up from my library. And that makes
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
So that's actually 12 books in April. I got my math wrong. Where the Lost Wander, before I forget, before my mind wanders off, is a wagon train story about a woman with her family. She's a young widower. She comes across with her family to settle in the West, and the trials and tribulations of the wagon train, but also the forming relationship between half Pawnee, half white scout / mule train guide, and the difficulties on both sides. It's dual POV, which was really well done in this case. But for this one, it starts out with the climax event and then spends 3/4 of the book leading you up to that, which was weird, and I think definitely a preemptive move on the part of either an editor or the writer herself. That was because starting off on a wagon train is not going to catch anyone's attention these days. So that definitely hooked me in the first chapter, and then I was like, so how's this, and when's that, and then when we finally got to that, I was definitely like clipping along, and the action was definitely happening and stuff, so it was a good tale. I can't remember why I picked it up, which sort of bugs me. I requested it months and months ago, so it's been on hold for the library for a long time. I'm not sure why. It's an Amazon imprint, like Union Publishing, so maybe I was trying to see like what kind of things they publish. I don't know. But yeah, so that's my dozen. And this is going to be too long to try to do both. I will stop with the April wrap-up and come at you Tuesday, maybe, with the May TBR, which is behind me here. If any of you can spy the things on there, you've got a sneak preview, but it's kind of dark, so if not, just wait a couple days, and I'll see you again soon. Bye, guys. Thanks for watching. I don't know, highfalutin's not the word? Now I have to go back and look at what I turned down. Ooh, look at that, I turned down corners and you can't stop it. Didn't prepare for this wrap-up, so I'm just sort of processing it on camera.